Hello, and welcome to today's event on the next wave of data portability. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm director of the Center for Data Innovation. The Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of data technology and public policy. Today, we're going to be hosting a discussion around data portability, which is the ability of users to transfer their personal data from one service to another. If you haven't seen it, we put out a great report on this topic earlier last week, available on our website, DataInnovation.org. And we really dig in this report into the opportunities that data portability offers, such as empowering consumers, spurring more innovation in various sectors, and increasing competition. And what we're seeing is that data portability provisions are appearing very frequently in data protection legislation, as well as standalone policy proposals. So our goal today is to have a discussion about the ways in which lawmakers and regulators can optimize data portability provisions, avoid some of the pitfalls we've seen in implementing data portability, and just foster more data-driven innovation by examining some of the key sectors where data portability is being deployed today in the United States and around the world. This is meant to be a participatory discussion. So we have ways for those who are watching online to submit your questions to our panel. We are using the platform Slido, which allows you to submit and vote on questions that you would like to have answered. If you're watching on the Data Innovation website, you can find the link underneath the video. If you're watching on YouTube or one of the other streaming platforms, you can find the link in the video description. So we have a really fantastic set of experts here today to discuss these issues. First, Ali Lang, Public Policy Manager at Google, Michael Murray, who's the President of Mission Data, Nico Skavaski, who's co-founder and President of Redox, and Ben White, who's in charge of policy research and advocacy at Plaid. So thanks to all of you for being here today. And Ali, I want to start with you, and I want to start really at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about what is data portability? Why does it matter? And what are some of the benefits that we're seeing around data portability?
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks to you and the Center for Data Innovation for convening this important conversation. This is going to be great. As you mentioned, data portability is at its heart the ability to transfer data from one source to another. Google has been working on data portability for over a decade. We were the first to offer the ability to do what we call take out your data from some of the core products at Google. And over the years, we've expanded that capability now to where you can really export your entire account in sort of a fairly easy set of steps. And you can also do just particular products. For example, we find that people moving their photos is a very common use case. And actually, I think there's a couple of dimensions that are useful to lay out when we're talking about portability. As far as what we have observed over the last decade or what people are looking for from this functionality. I mean, having offered it for many, many years, we have the benefit of kind of observing how people really use it, what are things they value, how do you make sure people know it exists, things like this. And I think those could be useful for this conversation. So one thing I would note is that there's sort of a vocabulary challenge, I think, around data portability. People often talk about data portability in the context of leaving, right? They would say you take your data and you think of it sort of as a bank, right? You transfer your money from one account to another. It no longer exists in the first account, and now it only exists in the second one. With data portability, more often you're copying, you're making a copy. And in a lot of cases, people are downloading a copy to their own device to have a backup or to explore it. We see data portability used very frequently as a transparency tool. People want to understand what's in their account. They want to see everything in one place. They want to explore all of this data kind of on their own device. And so it's a really useful transparency tool is one use case. And downloading for backup is a very common use case from our point of view. I would just note, though, that when people download something for backup, that's the end of our visibility into what they're doing. So that's something we see as quite common. And then we wouldn't know if they've, parsed that data in some way or uploaded it somewhere else. That's not something we'd have visibility into. But from our point of view, download is very common. Increasingly, when people talk about data portability, they're talking more about the idea of directly transferring something from one place to another. And in this case, you could think of it more as kind of moving something from a cloud account, right? So rather than you downloading and then re-uploading your data, you just sort of authorize in the background into two different locations. and say, I want this data to be copied over to this new source. Again, deletion is usually a separate process, which is an important distinction. Deletion, it should be separate, partly because portability does not have perfect fidelity. And so you don't want to delete something before you're sure that it's in the new place. So you want to make sure you've transferred everything appropriately. So deletion is a separate step. So with direct portability, there are a couple of interesting benefits. One is for folks who are operating in kind of different infrastructure or lower infrastructure environments, not having to download and re-upload the data, but being able to move it through the cloud is a massive cost savings, just literally on their cell phone data bill. In parts, there are significant parts of the world where you have to pay to download and re-upload something, and particularly upload costs can be quite high. The other thing is in a lot of places, people don't have personal laptops. There's a lot of parts of the world where people operate only on cell phones. And so your phone itself might have enough storage. So the trajectory of moving things behind the scenes is really, I think, a positive development for most people. When you're talking about the benefits, I think it really expands portability to a much wider audience of folks and sort of releases it from some of the infrastructure demands that you might have in some cases. And so I think that's been a really great development, and that's what the Data Transfer Project has been leading. The Data Transfer Project is an effort started by Google and other companies, including Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Twitter, and SmugMug recently joined, that basically promotes the idea of this direct data portability by creating an open source repository of adapters that enable other companies to participate in this system without developing all of the engineering. They can sort of come to the repository and participate. It's been a really constructive development. So I think just to your last question, in terms of the benefits, I think there's a huge amount of practical benefit to data portability. Like I was saying, it's a great transparency tool. It's a really excellent way to feel like you have a lot of confidence that your data is safe. If you feel like it's better on your device, in addition to being in the cloud somewhere, if you want to leave a company, it allows you to take your data, to delete it. There are two that I think are the most important benefits of data portability. One is really a sense of psychological safety, a feeling that you can, you don't have to, when you're first signing up for an account, you don't feel like you're making a lifetime commitment to whatever it is. You feel like you're going to be able to try more things. You feel confident that you're going to be able to access and export that data. I think that's really, really important for people. And the second is kind of, as I mentioned, the ability to try something new, I think is something that's really important. And so because the deletion function is not the same as portability, this also creates a chance for people to basically say, there's a new product on the market, I want to check it out, but I'm not quite sure I want to just like fully depart what I'm used to and switch over. So you can take little bits of your data, or you could take all of the relevant data type and move it into the new account, see how you like it, explore it. And again, you'd have that psychological safety that you could depart in some cases, depending on, Daniel, as you mentioned, depending on the regulations or what companies offer. So I think the main benefits of portability are just really foundational to encouraging people to try new services, encouraging people to create new services, knowing that there's some opportunities for people to try it out, and helping people feel reassured that they're, in control of their own account data. And that's what we've observed at Google over the last 10 years. It's been a very popular feature with people who use it. It's something that we understand makes everybody feel more confident. And yeah, it's just been a real, overall, just a really fantastic product that we've offered.
Thanks, Ali. Nico, I want to turn to you, because when we think about data portability, of course, the healthcare sector is kind of one of the first big sectors that was really impacted by this, with, originally HIPAA and then HITECH Act and, the 21st Century Cures. And we've seen, it used to be all your data was locked up literally in a file cabinet and you never had access to it. And then maybe it was on an on-premise system. And now we're finally getting some of it into the cloud and then maybe into mobile devices in the hands of consumers. How are you seeing data portability, enabling new innovation, enabling, new opportunities?
Yeah, I would say that in healthcare, the real innovation started on the B2B side. So it started where, just in the past, maybe 15, 20 years, we actually digitized a lot of electronic medical record data. And the first users of that data were software developers building applications for the enterprise health system. So think telehealth or patient engagement type applications, scheduling applications on your phone, things like that. And that's really where we've seen most of the innovation so far in the healthcare space. And those products were really made possible because the data was available over digital means. And the technicalities around the interfaces and how you actually get your hands on that data is still something that we're working through. But in general, a whole ecosystem of digital health applications has kind of emerged from that first wave of data becoming available. Right now, you mentioned the 21st Century Cures Act. That's really starting to open up data for consumer applications. And these are the sorts of apps that consumers would gravitate towards on their phone. This is the kind of long tail of applications that, you can imagine any sort of patient or any type of illness having its own specific app that would help a patient take care of themselves, or use the application to figure out, their medications or types of behavior that's going to help out with it. And those are the new types of applications that we haven't actually seen a lot of yet. If you look on, the various app stores, there's not actually a lot of healthcare specific applications that will actually use your medical data. But what the regulations are putting in place right now is the infrastructure that should allow that to be possible. And specifically, it's kind of an if we build it, they will come bet that the government is making on opening up that data, saying if we mandate that every health system has created access to the data via APIs, and the government actually specified a standard for those APIs, then applications will be built on top of that, such that patients can go into their medical records, pull it down from health systems, and then use that data on whatever application they want. Whether it's Apple's Health Kit, where it's basically just a view of the data, or you could sync it up and use it for transitions of care to get your medical records from your specialist to your primary care provider, to the hospital that they might be looking at. But the main thing is that the new regulations are focused on patient-directed, so the consumer side directing their data to move in different directions, which is really, I'm interested to hear what Plaid is looking at, because that's really the direction that Plaid created in the financial space many years ago, and we're just now getting to that in the healthcare world. So we're at the cusp of it, and I think over the next 5 years we're going to see a lot more applications being built on top of this consumer-directed data.
Thanks, Nico. And Ben, perfect segue to you, because as Nico mentioned, I mean, Plaid is that kind of data infrastructure in the financial sector. And I just wanted to kind of turn this initial question over to you about, what are the benefits of data portability? Why does this matter? And if you could talk a little bit about how this has been evolving in the financial sector, because I think it's a really interesting story, since it's been driven in part really by the private sector as opposed to government regulation. And now we're seeing it, at least in the US, and now it's kind of catching up with the regulation. So I'd love to hear your initial kind of thoughts on why data portability matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, initial thought is, hearing Nico describe Plaid as having innovated on this years and years ago, I think really gives a sense of how nascent this field in this industry is. For those who aren't aware, Plaid is a 9-year-old company that delivers API-based infrastructure to allow consumers to port their financial data across the financial services providers that they use. So historically, really the first innovation, and Plaid's founders themselves were trying to build a personal financial management application, specifically something that would allow an individual to see where they had spent money on a map recently. So leveraging really Google Maps API and trying to layer financial data on top of that to help individuals understand their spending habits. And what they found was that it was incredibly difficult to plug in on the back end to that application the relevant financial data, specifically, transactions that would show detail on where that money had been spent. So Plaid went out, set out to build that connective tissue for the ecosystem that allows, specifically in financial services where there are 11,000 banks in the United States, and quite a few applications on the sort of technology consumer-facing innovation side. That connective layer and tissue is really important to enabling innovation to happen. So having a single API plugin on the back end that then innovative startups can come and try to address consumer pain points really on a one-off basis is how this all got started. So Plaid's really primary customer in the early days was Venmo, where there was not a real opportunity for consumers to pay each other back for small items, a lunch or a shopping spree or something, and the ability to connect accounts together was something that was enabled by these data portability APIs. So, as you mentioned, Daniel, in the U.S., this is really grounded in a single stipulation in the Dodd-Frank Consumer Protection and Wall Street Reform Act, which came out after the financial crisis, which was really intended on giving consumers that transparency that Ali talked about. But Plaid and other companies in the space have built on top of that thesis that consumers have a right to control their financial data, and have built in sort of the automated infrastructure layer that allows consumers to authorize the transmission of their data for specific purposes. So when we think about data portability, specifically in a public policy context, and think about things like privacy, I think the paper that you put out, Daniel, puts it really well. It's a combination of both positive and negative rights. The positive right is this data belongs to you as the consumer, and you can direct it as you see fit. And then the negative rights are you should be able to instruct not only the deletion and revocation of that data, but just the same, what you would like not to happen with that information. In financial services in particular, I think with things like the credit reporting system, data has been portable and has been moving for a very long time, but largely outside of the control of a consumer. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and to see how some of the lessons that we've learned in the financial services space, where giving consumers that control over their data really incentivizes innovation for smaller companies, startups that have now grown to be the size of public companies to deliver on unmet needs in the financial services space, entirely under the discretion and control of their users' ability to share their financial data.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Ben. And Michael, I want to go over to you too. And I think probably the average person understands they have health data and they have photos and they have financial data, but they might not be thinking about their energy data. And so I wonder if you can not only talk about kind of why data portability matters in the energy space, but also kind of what data this is and how it's being used.
You bet, and thank you for the opportunity. It's great to chat with all of you. We're in very different sectors, but throughout this conversation, we'll see a lot of similarities, I think. So with energy data, I'm referring to electricity and natural gas consumption in homes and buildings, and the billing records that are related to that. We're not talking about like oil and gas energy sector. We're talking about generally the electricity and sometimes natural gas. And just to give you an example of how you might use this, electric utilities are generally speaking regulated at the state or local level, and so there's a lot of balkanization just geographically based on how this industry was set up a century ago. And one company that has made several headlines in the tech sphere, and they're also members of our coalition, is called OhmConnect. And they are the largest virtual power plant provider in the US. And just to give you a sense of what it is, they allow you to sign up on a smartphone app or on a website. And if you reduce your energy usage at certain times, like they'll say, from 4 to 5 p.m. or from 5 to 7 p.m. or something like that, then you can earn points and gift cards and actual money deposited into your PayPal account based on those verifiable reductions in your power usage. And the way that it works financially is that in the electricity system, every fraction of a second, supply and demand have to equal exactly. And so if you recall, these summer heat waves that we've had on the West Coast, in California last August, the grid operators have the option of either trying to build expensive, new, and generally dirty power plants, or they can try to reduce the demand at the same time. And this is where the sort of aggregation in a virtual power plant concept comes from. And so during this latest heat wave, there's something like over 150,000 households in California that through this gamified app were able to reduce their consumption. That delivered several hundred megawatts of electrical capacity to the wholesale power market in California, and without exaggeration, kept the lights on for millions of Americans throughout that heat wave. It's a lot faster to join a sort of social network and hear about this from your friends and build up a certain amount of megawatts through the internet than it is to go through the permitting and construction of a new power plant. And so that's kind of the applications that we're talking about. There's many others for the commercial building sector that all rely on a similar portability. Interestingly, you don't, deletion of data is not really in discussion here because the electric utility needs that information for billing and providing service to you. So you're never really going to delete it. But there's a lot of digital innovation that can happen that these, 100-year-old monopolies are just really not suited to provide. And so as the power sector in general moves from, highly centralized power plants to a very distributed model where there's more of these virtual power plants and people have more rooftop solar and electric vehicles, you can control when they, charge and discharge and things like that. That means there's a bottleneck to a lot of that innovation is just getting the consumption information off of the meter and as well as some of the back office billing information from the utility.
Thanks, Michael. And, I think that's a great example of the type of really powerful innovation that can be enabled by data portability. I want to focus a little bit for the next question on competition issues, because I think, data portability often comes up in this question of competition. Certainly in the tech sector, there's a lot of conversations right now about how to enable more competition. We see this in financial sector as well. So maybe Ben, maybe I'll start with you on this one. What is the role of data portability in fostering competition, and it kind of what different levels do you see that competition play out?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot has been said and sort of acted upon, and I think will be acted upon in this space, especially in this political moment that we're in, where competition seems to be a rising policy issue at lots of levels of the government. In the financial services context, we tend to think of data portability under the umbrella of a concept called open banking, which tends to refer, again, to a consumer's ability to authorize and ultimately share their data across providers. And the open banking concept, specifically from a regulatory standpoint, was introduced first in the United Kingdom, actually building off of the Second Payment Services Directive, which as part of back when the UK was part of the EU, sort of set the rules for how payment systems would work in Europe. And specifically from a competition standpoint, made the case that consumers' ability to control and port their data would incentivize new entrants into the payments sphere first. And then the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK sort of examined the state of the banking sector in the UK and found that, with 9 major banks really dominating the market, applying this concept of data portability to financial services could incentivize new entrants to come in and offer competing and hopefully better products and services, specifically products and services built for a digital era. So for those who have kept any sort of eye on fintech developments, you'll probably know names like Revolut or Monzo or N26, which are firms that really came out of these regulatory efforts in the UK to try to induce more competition in the banking sector by allowing customers to first port their financial information, but as a result of sharing that information, really open new accounts and benefit from new products and services offered by these new entrants. In the US context, I mentioned just that one line of Dodd-Frank Section 1033, which provides consumers the ability to share their financial information. We actually, I think just last week, there were some announcements out of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with regards to overdraft fees, which are really harmful to consumers in the United States today, and are really a point of emphasis and a point of effort from the CFPB. And CFPB Chair Rohit Chopra specifically said that if it were easier for consumers to move their accounts around under an open banking system, we would likely see things like overdraft fees, more rapidly disappear. So when we think about competition, innovation, and consumer choice and consumer benefit, really opening up the data and giving consumers the ability to use any number of services will incentivize startups and new entrants to identify those pain points and go out and build services for them. And it's for that reason that open banking really globally is seen as a competition and an innovation issue. So even as we sort of think about philosophically from a policy standpoint, what competition means and how it is meant to operate and under what objectives we're currently working, I think in all cases, data portability, not just as a concept, but as in actual practice, is pro-competitive. And I think that's widely recognized by regulators everywhere.
Thanks, Ben. And Ali, I want to turn to you on this question as well, because obviously the tech sector has been a big focus of questions around competition. So I just want you to kind of reflect on this, and also, perhaps, one of the things we talked about in the paper we put out was the distinction between portability and interoperability. And I think sometimes those issues are conflated. And in this context, we want to talk specifically about data portability and its relation on competition.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. It was on my mind too, particularly as Michael was talking about something that felt a little closer to more of a synchronous or like real-time access to data, which I think portability is maybe one step further back, where it's really user-directed and sort of a single download. So I think there's a spectrum between portability and interoperability, and it's fun to have folks on the line who are coming in from different kind of points on that spectrum. I mean, fundamentally, I agree with Ben. Portability is table stakes for competition. The thing I'll tell you from doing data transfer project outreach is that you really, I think that it's more common than you would believe for companies to have a position that's not in opposition to portability, but really it's about prioritization. And where policymakers can come into play is really creating the incentives that need to be in place for companies to invest in the engineering and invest the time to make these products work well for people, to make the UX understandable, to make the data types, the right data types, to offer a variety of sources or places for data to go. And the data transfer project is trying to reduce those engineering burdens to encourage folks to be in the room, or to offer this service. But I do think we need policymakers to participate. I would say that if you're looking at in the competition debate, I think could probably benefit from some of the lessons learned under GDPR, or the way that portability is constructed under GDPR. I think it is very sensible, the boundaries the GDPR have drawn in terms of focusing on provided data, which is things that you've created, your emails, in our case, emails, docs, photos, things that you intentionally participated in the creation of. And then it includes observed data, which for Google is things like your search history or your YouTube watch history, but it does not include inferred data. And I think that's a really reasonable boundary to draw. I think the first two data types provide a really important opportunity for the types of innovation that Ben and Michael have referenced, in terms of, in Michael's case, like, is there something that a different entity could do with the same data that could be really innovative, that could really solve a big world problem? I think that's really cool. Or as Ben is saying, like, can you create and incentivize folks to join the market, can offer a new service? I think that both of the data types of provided and observed do create that opportunity. I think the interoperability piece is like an n-squared complicated question from portability. As far as privacy and security go under portability, because so many services have created and offered this for so long, I do think we have a pretty good understanding of the baseline protections that need to be in place to provide portability securely for a lot of data types. Although, my colleagues on the line have a slightly different data type kind of ecosystem than what I'm used to operating in. For interoperability, I think it does get a little bit harder. So I think it's very easy to get folks to agree that portability is a good idea. And I think that's a perfectly great place to start. And then as you build that muscle memory, both among users and companies, as you create the incentives for more folks to offer it, it'll kind of clarify some of the things about interoperability that you could then, try to navigate. So I guess, or you'd have a better baseline to navigate. So I guess at the end of the day, my answer on this one is the same as Ben's. Portability is really important to competition. I think, we know enough about it to offer a really safe option. There's a lot of places you can.
Ali, I think we lost you for a minute there, but I think you were right at the end. So I guess if we had to lose you, that was a good spot to lose you. Nico, I want to turn to you and then Michael too on this question, just because I think it's one of the most kind of fundamental, important questions. In healthcare, you mentioned that, first of all, data portability is enabling this long tail of innovation, and so I think there's some interesting competition there. I was wondering if you could talk about that. But then also, we also don't think about healthcare as traditionally a very competitive field, at least in the U.S. You don't go to one doctor over another because of the prices they're charging. So how do you see the linkages there, and how do we draw the lines on? Ali had made an interesting point about what data to include in data portability. I think when you're talking about the data that users upload to a service, it can be crystal clear that that's definitely the data you want to be able to get out. When it's a service provider, though, like in healthcare, where those lines are maybe a little harder to draw, how do you make that distinction about what data should be included and what data shouldn't be? Have you advised policymakers on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic in healthcare, because healthcare does not like to think of themselves as being as competition, right? All doctors have a shared mission of keeping patients healthy, and all hospitals are trying to do the same. But when it comes down to the business, right? Health systems are in competition with each other, and when they lose a patient to go to a different health system, they actually call that leakage. The patient leaks out of the system of providers that they have, and making the data portable actually allows patients to do that more freely and more easily. Because if you've been seeing the same, if you've been a patient at the same health system for your entire life, and there's a lot of reason to stay with that health system because they know your entire medical history. But if you can pull it out and move to a new health system, then it lowers that barrier for your patients to actually move between organizations that you might be competing with. So there was really perverse incentives. There are perverse incentives to data portability because of that competition aspect, and that's where the regulators have focused most of their attention on. How do we actually open that up? So that's sort of one bucket of where I think policy was necessary in order to generate the innovation required to allow more competition. Because what's happening now that your data is more portable, and we have better technologies out there, and just consumers that are more willing to do things over the internet. The pandemic was a huge driver for that. Telehealth went from 5% adoption to massive adoption. Probably around 25% now is where it's kind of settling, but that allows for a lot of new style providers to enter the market. So instead of going to whatever provider whatever specialist your primary care provider suggests for you, you can actually go and shop a little bit and try to find one. And for every single type of ailment, there's a new care provider that's launching a telehealth service online, or a quasi telehealth service. So the competition has really picked up because of that data portability and the change of consumer behavior. The other area of competition that is a little less known is around the actual technology vendors themselves. They're in healthcare, because of the past regulations, we have kind of a small handful of very large vendors, electronic medical record vendors, that are the cornerstones of the market. And because of their placement in the market, and this is because of the regulatory history and the government really subsidizing the adoption of medical records, because of those vendors' place in the market, they have an ability to essentially expand their services to different types of technologies. And if they hold on to the data within their electronic medical records and not make it available to other vendors, then they can actually have a competitive advantage and really put a moat around technology based on their data that they have. And so that's another area where the government has come in and said that is not allowed, so that they actually created a term for that called data blocking, and defined it as, if you have a privileged asset of data, you have to actually make it available to other vendors based on what the health system or the provider wants to use. So instead of being kind of locked into a whole enterprise suite of data, really doctors and hospitals and health systems are allowed to say, I want to use the best of breed approach and connect them all, using interfaces that are mandated by the government. And so that's an area of competition that I think over the last decade has been really difficult to, and that's really what Redox does. We open up that data to different vendors, but as of the last year or two, the regulations have become very clear that type of behavior is no longer legal, and there are financial and other ramifications for doing data blocking if you're one of these vendors that is in a privileged position. So yeah, it's a very interesting space as far as competition goes in healthcare, but I think we're making a lot of moves towards opening up in a way that will hopefully see a lot more innovation in the healthcare technology space in the years to come.
Hey, Daniel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I respond to that? Because that was so interesting.
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point. And I think this is a really important issue that shouldn't be lost here. As enthusiastic as I am and we all are about data portability, that it depends on the context in which you're operating, how much infrastructure already exists to make it easily possible. So Nico's excellent point about data types and proprietary data types is really important, right? And I think if you're looking at the types of data that Google mostly operates in, most of these things have a pretty common file type, right? Like we could all name file types of photos. People understand the idea of like email being federated. Like there's a fairly decent amount of interoperability in the smallest stakes sense of the word, right? These things already we know, we understand the file types for them, or you can translate things. Like you can export a Google Drive into a doc format, for example. But in some fields, there is not that much clarity, or even in some newer data types, like what's the file type of, a chat stream on a YouTube video? What's the file type? I mean, you could do a lot in comma separated value, but is that the only way you do it, right? Like what are the new file types? And where this becomes really interesting, in my opinion, is when you get into non-personal data. So in Data Transfer Project, we've talked a lot with folks in the agriculture industry, like what are file types for irrigation records? What are file types for chess games? We talk to folks who play chess and they want to be able to port their chess games into new chess platforms. So there's really an interesting question about, as enthusiastic as we are about the potential for data portability to improve, competition in the market and consumer experience of these services, there is a fair bit of work that needs to be done on specifying and making some of these file types kind of reasonably transferable. And so I think that's the kind of thing where you can also see a good role for policymakers, and also the standard setting community can play an important role in engaging here. And that's one of the key priorities for Data Transfer Project, is really working on specifying those file types, looking at different data models, building the middle piece of the infrastructure so that things can transfer from one to another relatively seamlessly. And so that is all a lot of work. And I just the point I'm ultimately making here is like, these are great things to do, but some of them do take time and they take a lot of investment from different folks. So it couldn't be the case that you could just switch on data portability for everyone tomorrow. There is still a fair amount of work that needs to be done in connecting the dots on some of these proprietary data types or different contexts.
Thanks for that. And Michael, I want to turn to you and maybe, build on some of Ali's points, especially the point about you can't just flip a switch and turn it on. You probably know that better than anyone because you've been trying to flip the switch in states all across the country around energy data, and have seen the different types of roadblocks that exist. So maybe you could talk about it in terms of competition, but also just where are the challenges in actually scaling up data portability in the energy sector. What are the roadblocks that you've come across? How are you dealing with them? And how are you starting to think about moving forward in this area?
Yeah. So just a quick note on competition. Electricity is not like a normal market by any stretch of the imagination. This is the power grid is a multi-trillion-dollar asset, one of the largest engineering feats that humankind has ever created. And some of the competition dynamics may seem counterintuitive because a lot of the incumbent utilities, not all of them, but many of them, own transmission and power plant assets, and they want those to keep making money for a very long time. And so if you have like a virtual power plant that reduces the need for those power plants or reduces the prices that they could get in the open market, then that's not something that you're going to want to help facilitate. So it makes sense to sort of, hold on to the data that you have and box out anyone that could potentially depress wholesale market prices. There's something like 31 nuclear power plants in the United States that are exposed to, wholesale power market prices. And, a lot of those are in the red already. And so they're really not interested in having, prices reduced even further, even though that would be good for consumers, right? So some of on the challenges front, so often we see cybersecurity as an obstacle for why, you could never have your energy data get transferred from one place to another. I always think this is kind of a funny argument because, people do this fairly frequently with their financial and health data. And the idea that, there's like some, grave risk associated with your energy usage information being released is just like, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. I'm not callous about privacy. Like, I do care about privacy. I think what, you do in your home, your power bills, those should all be private. But at the same time, these are not what you might call, critical energy infrastructure of the type that, the president has issued executive orders regarding cybersecurity and how important it is to have, power plant control systems like separated from, the larger internet, so that we don't have, what the Ukrainians experienced with a, hack that eventually brought down their power grid in 2014 or 2015. So I see a lot of hyperbole and exaggeration from the utilities claiming that, if we were to provide your energy usage data, that would be the end of the world as we know it, and the power grid would go offline for months. And so obviously that I don't put a lot of credence in that view. I think there are some legitimate cybersecurity issues which we can be addressed through open standards that we use on the internet, things like OAuth 2.0 for exchanging permissions. That sort of thing is very simple. But there's a couple other problems, sort of practical problems in the trenches, if you will, that we've seen. One is a lack of a comprehensive data set. So some utilities will provide just your energy usage information, like kilowatt hours, but then some of them will also provide, let's say, your billing information or your account information or other things. And if you're like a multifamily property owner and you're trying to manage energy usage and you're in one of the major American cities that requires you by law to track and report your energy usage and actually to meet certain targets in terms of carbon dioxide emissions per square foot per year of your building, like we see in Washington, D.C. and New York, you need your billing and account information. You have to have that. And so a utility that says, oh, I'll provide you with your usage, you might as well provide nothing at all, because it's just not that helpful. So we need much better requirements around like what is a comprehensive data set. And that's something that we've been working on in a few states recently. It gets pretty complicated, particularly when you have regional differences and, what is a distribution charge on your bill? Well, utilities in New Hampshire call that differently than the utilities in California, and then Texas is sort of its own world. It does things differently. So all of those things, I think it's a solvable problem, but it needs to be worked out.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I want to kind of open this up. Maybe Ben, you can take this, but Nico, if you want to weigh in there too, or Ali, on the question of privacy and security, and then of course the related question of liability when something goes wrong. How are you thinking about these issues, and what do you think is the right balance between setting, those, making those decisions, those policy decisions, at the political level versus, as a kind of business to business, a contractual level? Ben, maybe we can start with you and then open it up.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier how different jurisdictions around the world have taken a different approach to financial data portability, and some are much heavier on the regulatory side and some are much more on the market side. The UK, I pointed out as sort of the exemplar of the heaviest handed approach to regulation, where every participant in the open banking ecosystem has to fall into essentially one of two buckets in terms of the services that they're providing, and then go out and actually register themselves and become licensed with an oversight body in order to perform those functions with consumer data. Here in the US, of course, every private company, private actor that is processing consumer data is beholden to data privacy laws as they exist today. And of course, everyone's very closely monitoring developments on both a state and a federal level with regards to data privacy. But with just sort of a much more fragmented market and the existence of several thousand third-party financial services providers in the US, it's a lot less likely, I think it's fair to say, even as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau considers rulemaking on Section 1033 of Dodd-Frank, that there will be some sort of centralized oversight body prescribing a sort of discrete set of rules for individual use cases, because there's also just a huge variety of use cases in financial services as well. So I think instead, probably the way to look at it, and for those who are really interested in getting weedsy, I can share the link to Plaid's lengthy comment letter to the CFPB on this issue, is that the really important pieces of infrastructure like Plaid that are actually initiating the transfer of data and touching many accounts, at consumers' behest and obtaining their consent and moving their data according to their wishes, those central actors are sort of the best place to do regulation and supervision. So Plaid asked for the CFPB to directly supervise aggregators as large participants, because that would ensure that as data is in transit around the ecosystem, it's fully, supervised and regulated as it should be, really on top of the existing privacy laws with which we already have to comply. With regards to the sort of security and liability issues, actually, Plaid just a couple of weeks ago launched what we're calling the Open Finance Data Security Standard, really modeled after the payment card industry data security standard, because part of data portability and opening up access to data does sort of lower barriers to entry for smaller companies to come in and offer products and services. Not every company operating in the space is of the certain size that they can go out and get a SOC 2 or go out and get an ISO certification for their security standards. So we actually put together a list, consulted with many of our customers on the smaller side of 63 different data security standards that are publicly auditable, and we're currently recruiting for folks to come and participate. So I think it's a mix of regulation and standards. And then, on the privacy front in general, just to take it back to the very first point, privacy, I think, is really evolving as an issue set for consumers and for policymakers from just a negative right, don't do things with my data that I wouldn't want you to a positive right of I can instruct you to move my data around. So keeping those in perfect balance is obviously going to be a regulatory challenge, but I think that the industry has taken some serious steps in the direction, whether it's through standards from an infrastructure perspective or standards from a data security perspective, to have a really high level of transparency from both a regulator and a consumer perspective.
Yeah, Nico, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. It just strikes me that coming off of the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, this idea of enabling third parties to have access to data suddenly was a really bad thing. At the same time that we're also talking about how it's a very good thing. And so I recognize that a lot of companies, providers, data, anyone holding data, any data controller, is thinking a lot about these issues, because they never want to be responsible for data going to a bad actor, and but they also know that they have obligations sometimes to share data. So how are you thinking about that in the health space?
Yeah, well, first off, I think that the Cambridge Analytica potential problem, we are probably like 3 years away from that even happening yet, because the infrastructure to allow patients to move data to what applications that they're choosing isn't in place. And so the baseline, like where we're getting to right now, which is I think years behind many other industries, is just making that possible to begin with. And then I think we're going to be hit with that challenge of, okay, now I moved all my medical records to a potential bad actor. And medical record data is it includes your PII, so stuff that people can use to do identity theft and things like that. But then also with that medical history, it can be used on the black market to fraudulently get access to drugs and things like that, where they can pretend to be you as a patient and then pick up prescriptions and use that to in nefarious purposes. But I think beyond the consumer directed access to data, which I think is the direction the industry is going, the thing that I think is really appalling about the healthcare industry is that every single health system out there who has your medical record, they have a series of, in terms of HIPAA, they call them business associates, where every business associate of a health system can have access to that data as well. And every health system has hundreds, maybe thousands of business associates. And these business associates are like the scheduling vendor, the software that schedules you, or the radiology company, or all of these different types of technologies that a healthcare organization uses. They can have access to your data. And as a patient, your data is not only at the health system, but all of their business associates. And it's pretty much impossible for you to figure out where your data might be. And based on the regulations right now, there's nothing saying that a health system has to track that to that specific level. And so if kind of in a GDPR style request from a consumer, if you go to your health system and say, show me what data you have, like they have to show you that. They have to give it to you in an electronic format, which for most health systems, that's literally they burn a PDF onto a DVD and then hand you the DVD, which for most consumers are like, what do I do with this? I don't even have a means to look at this information, but that's like the standard for how health systems release data to you. And you can ask them to delete it, but it's literally gone out to all of these different business associates already. And so if we had a policy like GDPR in the US, I think healthcare would be totally not ready for something like that. And there's the infrastructure to do that is not in place. And it'd be a total overhaul of how data is created and transformed and shared in the healthcare space. And I think it's necessary. So at Redox, we're actually preparing for that to enable patients to actually figure out where all of their data is, because we see 15 million patient records a day going through our system, and we send them to hundreds and hundreds of other vendors and health systems. So we can kind of keep track of that. But I think that most data in healthcare is kind of just transmitted into the ether of business associates and just kind of lost from that perspective, because health systems do not keep track of where it all goes.
Thanks. So we have a little less than 10 minutes left, and I want to pivot to some of the audience questions. The first one, it kind of goes to Michael and also Hallie. The question was, how can you kind of come up with the price of data in the energy sector? What's the price of data, and could this be extended to other data, other personal data? And that's where, Hallie, I'd like to bring you in too. I think a lot of times policymakers, both consumers are thinking about this, obviously, but also policymakers are thinking about, how valuable is this data? Is it worth the cost of opening it up? How do you think about those questions?
Sure. On the energy data front, there have been a couple of studies, not very many on this. You can get some benchmarks for the value through like triangulation of via different methods. One method that is kind of funny, that the average person probably has no idea this exists, is the large multi-site commercial building owners or tenants, like retail chains, investor-owned commercial office buildings, things like that. They typically pay a fee for someone to digitize all of their bills. So imagine, Starbucks. They have whatever it is, 25,000 locations globally. And every month they have to pay on time an electric bill, gas bill, water bill, telecom bill, and a waste bill. And so there's companies out there that say, for whatever, $2.50 a bill, we'll digitize it, give you all the information you need, and you wire us a lump sum of money, and we'll make sure that we pay the bill on time, right? So that you don't accrue late fees and that type of thing. So one way of looking at the quote unquote value of that in that case of, bill digitization is maybe $2.50 a bill, right? Just round numbers. There's other examples in the consumer world where there's value that can be created through energy conservation, both to the local power grid as well as to the wholesale power grid. And it's an enabler, so it's not, the data portability alone does not instantly mean you get this value, right? But when you combine it with some device control, a smart power strip, a smart thermostat, there's other things you can do behaviorally in your house to reduce your consumption, that then you have the usage data that's portable, and then some value gets created. So there are ways of trying to look at it from like a larger economic perspective to see what the value is. But another one just that I'll mention quickly is that a lot of pension funds require entities that they invest in to give reports, ESG reports, and those the environmental portion of that highlights, you have to report total energy usage, natural gas, electricity, and so, water usage across potentially thousands of different locations. And if you speak with the people that are actually in charge of collecting that information from like a global enterprise, it is hell on earth. They have an incredible number of interns that are just there, getting bills, like getting information from here to there. And so the replacement cost of getting that information just through, interns and busy work, frankly, is another way you could value it.
Thanks, Michael. Ali?
That was a perfect segue into a point I wanted to make, which is we've talked a lot in this call about data portability as an export function, but I think the question is somewhat less speculative than you might think, right? So Google's offered data portability for 10 years, including data types that I think people would think are the type that would have a monetary value to the market, right? Like your browser history, the ads history, stuff like that, ads you've seen. Nobody's built an import function for that data. And I don't know why, but I think you could speculate a couple of things. One really builds on what Michael was saying, which is the structure of data. You really have to work at structuring data to work in your own system. So even like we were talking earlier about, file types and transferable file types, then the next step is it really has to work in your structure. And so having interns manually re-enter data or compare data, or even the vocabulary Michael referenced of like, it's called this in some places, a terminology difference, those things really gum up the works a little bit. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But I also think that there's kind of, depending on the point of view of the person asking the question, either excitement or speculation, negative speculation, that creating data portability could cause people to, start selling their data willy-nilly or start participating in schemes where you would get like some % discount or something like this for importing data. I think that's a really interesting question to ask, and I do think it's one that belongs in the conversation. And I think an important part of the answer is to look at what is already true today. I don't think it needs to be entirely speculative. I think you can look at what are the data types that are available, have these types of markets been generated around them, and if not, why not? And if you're doing something different, will it change it? Depending if you see it as a risk or an opportunity, I think those foundational kind of checkpoints can be really useful for, forecasting what you think might happen next. And so that would be what I would note. But I agree with Michael that I do think there's sort of a public perception that anything involving data is just sort of like somebody else will do it and it will just work. But a lot of this is a huge amount of work. Like it is a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of compute cost. Like if you're moving big data sets, there is a cost to that, like a literal expense. So I think there's maybe a desire to wave a magic wand that we have to hold back from a little bit, but I don't think it's entirely devoid of like any reference point from the current state. I think you can learn a lot by looking at what's true today.
Thanks. So we just have maybe 2 minutes left. So maybe one final question. I'll give this one to Ben and Nico. It came in basically, as many countries and states are considering updates to their privacy laws, including looking at data portability, what's your kind of key message to policymakers? What do you want them to know? And Ben, why don't we start with you and then Nico?
Oh, sure. Sorry, Nico. I saw you seemed very, very eager to take this one, but I'll try to be brief. I mean, I think, not to be a broken record, but to sort of go back to that positive and negative rights framing, like consumers, as Ali was just saying, not just from a technical perspective, but from a sentiment perspective, I think have grown to really fear the world of data and what's going on largely sort of behind the scenes, out of sight, out of mind for them. And there is, a need as we think about bringing data portability more into the fold to really emphasize clarity and transparency, such that, when consumers engage with the types of tools that data portability enables, they feel comfortable, they feel confident, and this is a real improvement on the sort of current state of play where a lot of this is taking place in the background. I would leave it there and pass over to Nico.
The big thing from my perspective, and I understand the political challenge of this, but national laws, I think, are so much better for the industry than state by state regulation, just because there's actually there's tangible network effects that are measurable, and our ability to innovate across entire regions rather than on a state-specific level. So when states have very specific different laws than each other, it creates a ton of barriers for companies to figure out how to innovate in each state. I think Canada is a really great example of this, in that in Canada, each province has very different laws, and it makes it very difficult for companies to attack the entire Canadian market at once. So I am a big proponent of let's get something nationwide that we can all say is good enough and states can support, rather than each state creating their own, just because it creates a lot of challenges for innovators in the space.
Thanks so much for that, Nico, and thanks to everyone for your comments, and to our audience for your questions and participation today. This is obviously a really interesting area. It's one where we're seeing a lot of developments, and we're going to be continuing to focus on this work in the months and year ahead. So if you have further insights or comments, please send them our way. We'll be continuing to follow these issues. But just again, thank you to our excellent experts for joining us on this panel. Really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to continuing to engage with you on these issues.
Thank you very much.